Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. Happy Wednesday, happy hump day, everybody. We should have a fantastic show ahead for you guys. Similar to yesterday's show, a couple more betting odds I'm going to present to you, a couple more IDP player profiles along with that as well. It should be a very well-rounded show. We'll start off with the world of football, the updated Super Bowl odds. Is anyone going to challenge that duopoly at the top of the Chiefs in the AFC and Niners in the NFC? Then we'll look at the World Series odds as well. Very even top 5 teams in terms of betting odds. And then, of course, we'll round it out with a couple of defensive player profiles. But before we begin with all that, I do want to remind you, as always, at the beginning of these shows, to like, follow, and subscribe to all the shows on our network and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all. Plus, we do receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. But without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment of the day. It should be a tasty one. We are going to the world of football, but not in a way that you think. We're not starting off with player profiles. We are starting off in the world of betting odds, in the world of making futures bets, so to speak. With the updated Super Bowl odds for the upcoming season, it is fast approaching, and I want to keep you guys as updated as humanly possible before you make any decisions concerning which team you are going to bet on, if you do bet on the Super Bowl. Without further ado, let's look at the top 10. I think I'm going to break this into groups of 2 teams because there are a lot of similar teams in this list. There are a lot of teams that I want to give extra attention to maybe because they weren't this high last year. But overall, it's a very exciting list. And let's start off with the bottom 2 teams here. 2 teams that actually played each other last year with a very interesting result. The Cowboys and the Packers both at 18-1 odds. Not too long odds, but 2 teams that have not had the playoff success that you would expect of them. Obviously, the Packers last year were a much changed team, much revamped team. New look at quarterback with Jordan Love. Very, very weird receiver room where there was no clear number 1. And then look at the Cowboys, who always seem to fall up short in the postseason, and they played each other. The Packers blew away the Cowboys at their place in AT&T. And so, looking at these 2 teams, I think the Cowboys deserve to be a bit lower, actually. I don't think they're both on level terms because the Packers right now are one of those interesting teams that, while they don't necessarily have the high-profile players of other teams in this list, they're very well balanced. And Jordan Love seemed to be very composed last year, in terms of knowing that he doesn't have the number 1 guy, but that he can rely on everyone. It's an every man for themselves kind of offense, distribute the wealth, and it showed last season in the postseason. They were very close to knocking out the 49ers as well on the road. So this Packers team is set with the Cowboys. I really think of them as one of those teams that needs to let go of their stars. Dak, I believe, has done all he can for the city of Dallas. I don't necessarily see him maintaining a deep playoff run this year. I don't necessarily like the receiving core outside of CeeDee Lamb. Brandon Cooks is getting older. I like Luke. I like Ferguson in the red zone, but I don't see him as a blocking, all-around, seamless tight end who can make plays in the open field. But when it comes down to the eye test, let's say, I think the Packers pass it more than the Cowboys. They're a younger, more upside-heavy team, and right now, I feel like Matt LaFleur is comfortable with not necessarily deeming anyone to be my wide receiver 1 or my star player, because it really allows these young players to buy into the culture they're creating. So those 2 teams, I think, are heading in drastically opposite directions. And I would not be surprised if this is Dak's last year in Dallas. Let's switch to the middle tier here. We have the Texans at 16-1 and the Bills at 15-1. This also seems like a very weird pairing where the Texans could be higher than the Bills because they're also in the same boat as the Packers. They don't necessarily have a star number one receiver. Nico Collins could become that this year, and I really like what Tank Dell and Noah Brown, and they also brought in Stephon Diggs. Let's not forget about him. They're just a very well-rounded team. They did add stars, so hopefully that dynamic is not ruined between what C.J. Stroud and his other receivers have already built. But Stephon Diggs definitely gives you that verticality, that experience, that route running ability. And then you add Joe Mixon in the backfield, who adds that physicality, who has that explosivity. He's going to be very integral in how they play early downs. And I really like the Texans. And they could and should, in my humble opinion, be above the Buffalo Bills at 15-1 here because of the fact that the Bills don't necessarily have the number one receiver anymore. Obviously, if they get Brandon Ayuk, that's a different question. But right now, Keon Coleman's unproven. Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel are wide receiver 2s at best. And I really think they need to lean more on what they did to get into the playoffs in the first place last year, where you just have to shorten the passing game and make it more James Cook oriented. Because that's the only way I see the Bills deserving of a place above these young, hungrier teams on this list. And so I would say the Texans are a safer bet out of the AFC to challenge that duopoly at the top than the Bills. Then you go to teams like the Bengals and Lions and Eagles. Bengals at 13-1, Lions and Eagles at 11-1, who are all really in that 1A kind of group trying to break through in their respective conferences. For the Bengals, it's all about Joe Burrow's health. If Joe Burrow stays healthy, he is at the very least the third or second best quarterback in the AFC. And it really rejuvenates that team because last year, obviously, Jake Browning had a couple good games as his replacement. But at the end of the day, the Bengals start and go with Joe Burrow at the QB position. If Joe Burrow is healthy, I see the Bengals making it all the way to the AFC Championship. Because I think that at this moment, I would still say they're better than the Texans. That could change in 2 to 3 years. But it's all about maintaining the integrity of what they built. Obviously, T. Higgins is a little bit upset. He's going to test free agency. Perhaps at the end of the year, he's on a franchise tag now. But I still think they have a solid group to build around. You obviously have lost Boyd, but you still have Jamar Chase. You have an interesting crop of young receivers to build around should T. Higgins leave. And then you look at the Lions and Eagles, who both could interchange. These are both, at the very least, NFC Championship contenders. They're going to challenge that 49ers squad very heavily. I like the Lions. They just have to get out of their own heads. Dan Campbell especially, because his play calling is what's going to be integral. Obviously, Ben Johnson does an incredible job of running that offense, but it all comes down to what Dan Campbell's decision-making brings out of it, because if he keeps making these very, very important decisions like he did in the NFC Championship game and they fail, then who's to say the Lions will be out earlier than people think? They established themselves last year as a team to be reckoned with, but in order to maintain that, sometimes you got to play the game the way it's meant to be played. Sometimes you got to play safe. And I don't know if Dan Campbell is ultimately capable of that just yet. I like the system. Jared Goff looks the most comfortable he's been. Amon-Ra St. Brown is a wide receiver 1, first team All-Pro all day. I really love what he's done with that team. Their defense is rounding into form. I have questions about their secondary, but their front 7 is very potent. I love Aiden Hutchinson. I love what they're doing up there. I love their offensive line. So all those things need to come together around a plan that Dan Campbell can get behind without risking them being out earlier than people expect. And then when we get to the Eagles, I think the Eagles are a weird team because they seem to have this sense of dominance, but I kind of feel like they're rebuilding and retooling as well. More so retooling, but right now, I can see how people consider them a Super Bowl contender. If Jalen Hurts kind of gets back to what he was doing in his MVP caliber season when he got to the Super Bowl, if A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith can really help him and elevate him again, if the secondary behind an aging Darius Slay and a couple other pieces like C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Reed Blankenship can really coalesce, then this team might kick into gear because I really like what Nick Sirianni's doing. I think the Eagles can progress, but it's all about what phase they believe they're in. They can go all in, but they also need to sit back. And then, outside of them, you have the top three of the Ravens at 10-1, the Niners at plus 600, and the Chiefs at plus 550. And looking at the Ravens, they were just a game short of going to the Super Bowl for the first time in the Lamar Jackson era. They add Derrick Henry to the backfield, maybe to add more volatility to the way they approach the run game because it seemed to be a more running back by committee approach. But they add Derrick Henry to add more physicality, more grit perhaps. They still have Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews. If he's healthy, he's always going to be one of the better receivers or tight ends in the NFL. So the Ravens are ultimately in that kind of conversation to challenge the Dwap. But then the 49ers and Chiefs are the creams of the crop. The 49ers, best skill position talent in the league. Regardless of whether or not Brandon Ayuk leaves, they still have Debo, George Kittle, Jawan Jennings is a nice little option, and Brock Purdy is a steady presence. We'll have to see how he does without certain weapons, should they get injured as the year progresses. But what we've seen from him shows that he can be a competent, capable quarterback. And then, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs. When you have Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, you got to be the number one team in terms of Super Bowl betting odds. You add Marquise Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, the speed, the verticality, Rashee Rice rounding into a fantastic receiver, savvy route runner, fantastic hands that he showed in the Super Bowl. So ultimately, I am not mad that these two are at the top because they have the best skill position talent. They have the head coaches in both Kyle Shanahan and Andy Reid who are ambitious. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I can see a world where we get a third straight Chiefs 49ers Super Bowl. But that would just about wrap up this updated Super Bowl odds segment. Coming next, we transition to our first IDP player profile segment of the day with a young man in the New York Jets who's going to wreak havoc on opposing defenses for years to come now that the Jets are building and rounding to form in terms of their defensive prowess. You don't want to miss that segment when we come back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. I love presenting to you these new and improved betting odds, especially before these seasons begin. But we are now transitioning to our first defensive profile of the day with a guy from the New York Jets who I really love because he's so versatile along that defensive front. Without further ado, let's jump right into the player profile. But before we do, I do want to remind you yet again to please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link in the description, gsmc.cloud. Is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let us jump right into the player profile of Mr. Quinnen Williams. When this guy came to the New York Jets, it truly felt like a transition to the Jets really becoming serious about building their defensive identity. They knew that the offense was going to have its struggles. With Zach Wilson adjusting, they signed Aaron Rodgers, got hurt. But the defense has always been a constant. And at its center, in the middle of that defensive line, one of the better interior defensive linemen in the league, sits Quinnen Williams, who, when I look at him, can align anywhere on the field. He's a big, solid presence who's not just a run plugger, who just doesn't eat blocks. He can get to the quarterback. He can tackle you for loss. And as the Jets get better around him, not just in the secondary where I would say their main strong suits lay, but by adding pieces like Hassan Reddick from Arizona, by adding Javon Kinlaw to sit as well with him in that defensive front, and then a guy like Jermaine Johnson coming along in his second year. I really like what the Jets are going to do this year. I'm really hopeful about this Jets defense, especially if the offense is competent enough as to where they don't have to be on the field for long stretches of time. And so without further ado, let's jump right into why Quinnen Williams is going to be a huge part of that. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 467.5 fantasy points. Last year, he had 131.8, 39 solo tackles, 11 TFLs, 6 sacks, and 3 passes defended. Now, in the grand scheme of things, will Quinnen Williams' production go down now that the Jets have revamped their defensive line? I actually believe so, and here's why. When I look at the pieces they added, it speaks to a more physical approach. Javon Kinlaw isn't your prototypical defensive tackle. I feel like he's more of a hybrid where you can push him out to the edge, especially if Jermaine Johnson isn't as refined or polished as you think. I think that Jermaine Johnson definitely has a future ahead of him with the Jets, but at which position is going to be determined by how they value Javon Kinlaw, especially in a 4-3 defense where you need very lengthy, versatile players in your front. And then, when you go to your linebacker group, adding Hassan Reddick from Arizona, a player who has consistently improved year after year, really diversifies how you can play your front 4, front 3, or what have you, in terms of pass rush or run plugging. And so, what I really like about for Quinnen Williams in particular is that while he's going to maintain some stats, others will go down. And you're going to have to live with that and accept that as it comes in your IDP league. But in terms of him growing as a player, I think that having the season like he did last year, which was probably his most balanced season, really goes to show that when he has the personnel around him, Quinnen Williams is going to quickly learn that you don't always have to push yourself through a certain mindset. You don't always have to be like, hey, last year is probably the most important part of our front 7. I know that our secondary was going to carry us a little bit, but that was probably the most important part of our front 7. This year, we added more guys. I really like what I see out of Kinlaw. I like what I see out of Reddick. And this Johnson kid's going to come up through the ranks. So, Quinnen Williams, when I view him for this season especially, is definitely going to pop in stats that people might not expect. For example, let's look at how the Jets might run up in running situations. Quinnen could be more of a nose hybrid. He can align over either the center or the guard or tackle. He can play kind of a hybrid 4 tech, I see in my eyes, where he can hit the gap get in the backfield and get even more tackles for loss than we expect. Whereas Kinlaw can combine his strength with his speed and pass rush moves and that ability, and he can be more of a pass rushing defensive tackle. Depending on what we see out of Jermaine Johnson, whether or not he's even viewed as an immediate starter, I would like to see him kind of be the athletic edge rusher who, whether he lines up on the left or right, can add that value from the edge rushing, because by adding a guy like Kinlaw, you add so much versatility and kind of the element of surprise to your defensive setup, and it really allows you to focus more on alignments. And that's what I love about this Jets defense, is how their new additions will diversify alignments. I think that Javon Kinlaw is going to move around a lot. I think Jermaine Johnson's going to be tested at different positions. Hassan Reddick can blitz as much as he pleases because that's where he makes his bread and butter. And then the big question is, well, where does that leave a guy like Quinnen Williams? Does that kind of give him the advantage of rushing up the middle and getting more production there? Does that allow him to kind of allow others to focus on rushing the passer and him more, being the assister? And when I look at Quinnen Williams and try and place him in a box, it's kind of difficult to, because I know he's built as the perfect interior defensive lineman you would always want, especially in fantasy as well, because he adds so much value in terms of the stats he dominates in. But in this new look Jets defense, where out of all the players in the system, he's the one that remains constantly comfortable with where he stays, and so will Robert Saleh when it comes to alignments. It's going to be very interesting to see how that affects what he does and how he does it, because when you play the Jets and their defense, the scouting report is going to become much more difficult to parse through, because usually you would say, okay, maybe we want to stick more short to intermediate pass routes because their secondary is the best part of this. We have to account for Quinnen Williams up front, but outside of that, I think we should be fine. This year is a bit different because you have to worry about Kinlaw, where he's going to line up. You're going to have to worry about Hassan Reddick, whether he comes up in the blitz. You're going to have to worry about if Jermaine Johnson can improve and how he fits along this line. So it's going to be a different offensive game plan for people. And how it affects Quinnen Williams is, when you're the interior defensive lineman and your job is just to penetrate into the backfield, do teams now kind of run more on a loaded box than usual? Or do teams, especially in the AFC East, who are very well equipped to do this, get a bit more quick in their passing game? When I look at teams in the division, the Bills, the Dolphins, the Patriots even, I look at teams who are willing to get the ball out fast and quick, willing to stretch the field, willing to space out different players, and that worries me with Quinnen Williams because he's not necessarily a stationary player, but I feel like where he's most comfortable is just being able to apply pressure that worries the quarterback enough. And while he still can do that, I think that now that there's more edge rushing help, the ball is going to come out a lot quicker from opposing offenses than the Jets might expect. And they definitely have the secondary personnel, like I will talk about later, to cover that. But as of right now, Quinnen Williams is the puzzle piece that is going to have to maybe take a back seat. And it's no fault of his own. I still think he has value in certain areas. I still think he's going to dominate in terms of tackles and tackles for loss. That's what every defensive tackle's bread and butter is. But when I look at how this Jets defense is going to look and how opposing offenses might attack them, I'm certainly thinking that Quinnen Williams might get a little bit underappreciated and as a result might be a bit undervalued. And don't get it twisted. When it comes to defensive tackles, you can get no better than Quinnen Williams. He's always consistently improved year after year and cemented himself on that line. But is being a constant on a defense that's ever changing around you the best? In some cases, maybe. But for Quinnen Williams, it might not be. And so, I'm really excited and interested and very curious as to how the Jets' alignments are going to play out. Because no matter what, Quinnen Williams will stay there. The question is, what stat and what traits are going to allow him to dominate more than others? And that's what Quinnen Williams is ultimately going to become in the system. And that should just about do it for the segment. Coming next, we transition to another sense of betting odds. After the All-Star break and the excitement surrounding that, we look into the updated World Series odd and one of the more even top fives you can see in terms of betting odds in any league in sports. We'll be right back with that after this.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely...
Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast segment. Sorry, I got mixed up a little bit there. But we are about to switch yet again to another set of betting odds. This time in a sport that's already going on. It is after the All-Star break in this particular sport. And we are looking at the top 5 in terms of betting odds because they are very even. And this could be any team's race. That is, of course, the World Series and the MLB that we are talking about. Yet another baseball segment. This week has been chock full of them. Oh yeah, we got the All-Star break and the Home Run Derby, and now the updated World Series odds for you guys. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. Like I said, very even in terms of who is in that top 5. Very diverse, very top-heavy teams as well. And if any of them get going, then I see no reason as to why you wouldn't want to pick out of these top 5 rather than the field. So without further ado, let's jump right into the top 5. Starting off at number 5, one of the best teams in the NL, a very top-heavy team in terms of where they get their production from, and that is the Atlanta Braves. I think the Atlanta Braves are scary in that they have so much talent in terms of both power and contact, and their pitching depth is just good enough that you should be frightened of where the production comes from. Right now, in every single offensive statistical category, Marcell Ozuna, of all people, who would have thought he would have been the statistical leader, is leading. He has a .303 batting average, 26 home runs, and 77 RBIs. But you have guys who can make up the difference in that offense. I really like Ozzy Albies. I really like Ronald Acuna if he's healthy. Matt Olson. Freddie Freeman's not there anymore. But when I look at the Braves, I look at them in terms of pitching depth as well, because you have an ace in Max Fried, who I really like, but now you have an older guy in Reynaldo Lopez, who has one of the lower ERAs in the league, and then Chris Sale as well, this old guard for the Braves. If those guys get going, they have the experience to lead you on a deep playoff run. Chris Sale right now with 13 wins, and Reynaldo Lopez, one of the league leaders in terms of ERAs, with a 1.88 ERA. My only worry about the Braves is that the distribution of wealth factor kind of is starting to become a moot point. And say they make it all the way to the World Series, where the designated hitter won't be as integral to the outcome as possible. And so you're going to have to switch up your lineups a little bit, and you're going to have to find a way to manage your older pitchers as well. But when all is said and done, I look at the Braves and I think experience, and a plus 900 right now. I really like them. They sit atop the NL East, and they should have a pretty easy path to, say, at very least, the NLCS. I really like them out of the NL. Coming in at number 4, a team out of the NL, kind of a shock leader, but we shouldn't be surprised because of their youth and their firepower. It is the young, revolutionary Baltimore Orioles. I really like this Baltimore Orioles squad, led by the young guns in Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman. Gunnar Henderson, obviously, one of the league leaders in terms of home runs with 28. But then, another guy who's really come on is Anthony Santander. You kind of think of him as more of, say, a contact hitter, but now he also has 24 home runs. So I really like this balance of youth and experience. You have guys like Cedric Mullins, who adds depth, not just offensively, but defensively as well. One of the league leaders in terms of defensive runs saved. And then, obviously, in terms of pitching depth, you finally have your big ace in terms of Corbin Burns, who has a low ERA with 2.43. You have Grayson Rodriguez coming into his own with 11 wins. But outside of those two, that's where the concerns come in. I like the duopoly at the top of the Orioles pitching staff. But when I look at the other guys outside, I don't see that many stars. Maybe Dean Kramer can come on in the latter half. Kyle Bradish maybe. But right now, all I see at the top are Burns and Rodriguez. But in terms of this offense, if they keep mashing, they're really special. I really like how they're building this squad. And they're proving that they're not afraid of an AL East division with the big bad boys and the Yankees who we're talking about, and a Boston Red Sox team is kind of coming into their own. They're really going to be a force to be reckoned with. They might not have as much experience as other teams in the AL playoffs, but the fact that they made it last year with over 100 wins goes to show that this young team can really exceed expectations. And I wouldn't be surprised if they made it all the way to the World Series with the youth that they have. It's just the pitching depth that I'm a little bit skeptical about outside of Burns and Rodriguez. Coming in, though, at number 3, it's a team who's the talk of the town, the team with the most all-stars, the team that I really think has the most balance in the NL, the Philadelphia Phillies. Now, what I love about the Phillies is that when you look at their roster top to bottom, you obviously see, okay, they have the stars. They have the Bryce Harper. They have the Trey Turner. They have so much depth and experience as well. Then you look at guys like, say, Bryson Stott and Alec Boehm, who, if you remember, were vilified in the early stages of their careers in Philadelphia. Now coming into their own. They're one of the only teams in terms of offensive statistical categories where they have a balance between two guys. Harper obviously leads them in terms of home runs, 21. But Boehm also has a .301 batting average and leads them in RBIs as well. So, balance is key here, and experience is key as well. When I look at the Phillies, I say, why not them? You have guys who've made deep runs in the postseason in terms of Harper and Turner. You have guys who are coming into their own in terms of Boehm and Bryson Stott. You have the speed on offense in terms of Trey Turner as well, because he's an asset in terms of stolen bases. And when I look at their pitching staff, I really like that as well. Zach Wheeler, one of the better pitchers in the first half of the season, 2.70 ERA, 126 strikeouts as well. Aaron Nola as well, coming into his own again. He's always been one of those guys who, if he's consistent, he's one of the better pitchers in the MLB. Then I look at Ranger Suarez, who's had a good half, 10-4 record for them. And I really like what the Phillies are building here. And in the NL, where the only teams who are really scary are the Braves and another team we're going to talk about. Don't necessarily want to spoil them, but you should know who I'm talking about. I think this is a wide open NL, and I think the Phillies are definitely a team that could be prepared for that. Solid bullpen with Alvarado, Strahm, Hoffman. I really like the outlook for the Phillies, and the sky's the limit for them. One of the best teams in the league, 62-33, and the best record in baseball. And all is said and done, I could see them lifting that World Series trophy. But in the top two are two teams who clearly look like they're the best in their respective leagues, and so I wouldn't mind any of these top 5 teams moving up to kind of overtake this duopoly, but I think this is a very deserved top 2. Coming in number 2, obviously, the New York Yankees. When they signed Juan Soto, they expected to be a team that was fearful. The Bronx Bombers, yet again, they really have found that balance between Judge and Soto. Judge obviously leading the league in home runs with 34, 306 batting average, 85 RBIs. Soto with 23. They really found their duo that they're going to stick with in terms of the next 5 to 10 years. And in terms of pitching, Luis Gil has been a revelation. I really like how he stepped up because they didn't know what they were going to get in terms of Nestor Cortes coming back. Obviously, don't have much pitching depth outside of, say, a Garrett Cole. So they really needed someone. Luis Gil was a revelation. He had a very fantastic start to the season. Leads them in ERA. And when I look at the Yankees, my only concern is how these two, in Judge and Soto, are going to pan out in the postseason. I'm going to say something that might make Yankees fans a little bit irked, but I actually think it could play into their advantage. I can see the Yankees best suited being a wild card team. And I mean this in the best way possible because as a Rangers fan, as someone who understood the momentum that they had last year in the postseason, I think that if one of them kind of peters out towards the end of the year, being a wild card team and immediately having to go into the postseason can allow you to regain your level of success and sustain it throughout the postseason. So say if Judge falls off a little bit. If they're a wild card team, it means he can immediately try and solve what's going on, adjust, and grow into the postseason. That's most important. So I like the Yankees at 2 because they could be seen as undervalued, especially if they enter as a wild card. But right now, I think the team at number 1 just has less questions. But they definitely do have one big question that should be asked of them, and that is the LA Dodgers. That man right there on your screen. Shohei Ohtani, what more can we say about this guy? Leads them in all statistical categories, looking like an MVP caliber season. Perhaps one of the best seasons by a Dodger in their first year ever. Let's look at the stats. He has a .316 batting average, 29 home runs, only 69 RBIs, but hey, you can't win them all, man. But when I look at the Dodgers, obviously you have Shohei, you have Mookie, you have Freddie Freeman. You have that three-headed monster offensively. And then when you look at their pitchers, you have kind of this experience, but kind of more role player type guys. You bring in Tyler Glass now from Tampa Bay. He's off to a great start. But when I look at this team and see who they have, they definitely have the profile offensively to sustain a guy like Shohei Ohtani. They have, outside of their top three guys like Teoscar Hernandez, Will Smith, Gavin Lux that I really like. And so, I'm not necessarily worried about their depth. I'm more worried about whether or not this offense becomes a little bit too Ohtani-centric at certain times. If they get into the postseason and some of their hitters reach a slump and they're not necessarily producing, will Ohtani kind of fold under that pressure if his other teammates aren't delivering, or will he rise to the occasion? Because at the end of the day, Ohtani's going to be an all-world player no matter what. But you kind of need the team to sustain themselves around him, because he can't just do it by himself, as we saw in LA when he had Mike Trout but no one else behind him. So he moves to Los Angeles, across town, to basically win a World Series. That should be his ultimate goal. But when it's all said and done, I'm really, really looking at Shohei Ohtani as one of the better players. But before we go to break here, I do want to add a dark horse. One of my dark horses, have the Cleveland Guardians, man. At plus 1,500, that's a good value. And when you look at the top leaders in stats and look at batting average, you might think, oh, Shohei Ohtani is leading that. Oh, someone from the Phillies might be leading that. No, it is not. It is Steven Kwan at 352 batting average. Just goes to show how the Cleveland Guardians have built themselves. Steven Kwan being kind of that sabermetrician's best friend kind of player who hits for power and contact, mainly to get on base. And then you have a guy in Jose Ramirez who has sustained his level of power and hitting for power. We saw him in the home run derby. So I really like the outlook of this Guardians team, and I would not be surprised if they are surprised. But that will just about do it for this segment for today's show. Coming next, we transition back to our IDP player profiles with a player who I really like in a Los Angeles Chargers secondary, but just needs to stay healthy. That's it for him. We'll be back to talk more about Derwin James on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of today's show, and we have a stellar player profile segment. One that should be a very interesting one, as this player is also someone who has been beset by injuries, but also just because of the plus upside he brings to a Los Angeles Chargers secondary and ultimately defense as a whole that really wants to be revitalized under new head coach Jim Harbaugh. So let's jump right into the player profile of Mr. Derwin James. Obviously, when you think of guys in the secondary who have been injured, you think about guys like Jalen Ramsey, and then you immediately think about Derwin James. But you also think about these guys as players who, when they are healthy, are truly the best at what they do. And Derwin James playing that free safety, being the quarterback of that secondary, I really think that this could be a year where, should he remain healthy, should he get a full year of the Jim Harbaugh experience, he can cement himself as a safety who is a force to be reckoned with, and also in terms of IDP leagues. So without further ado, let's jump right into his stats. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 563.4 total fantasy points. His best year was actually last year with a total of 135.6 fantasy points. And we saw when he maintained his health, in terms of his stats, that he really had a fantastic year. 86 solo tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, 7 passes defended, 1 interception. What I really like about Derwin James is that he seems willing to learn, because throughout his career, he was utilized more as a blitzer. He was kind of one of those more Jamal Adams type safeties where he didn't necessarily get to be that coverage player that you can rely on the back end of your defense. And so people don't necessarily recognize that Derwin James can be a good coverage guy. And I think that Jim Harbaugh is going to be integral to how he molds him into that kind of player. But overall, looking at these stats, there's a lot to build on and improve on in terms of Derwin James. But that's one of the big question marks, because looking at what Jim Harbaugh brings to this defense really stems from his experience with the freedom he allows. And when I think about his Michigan defenses, I don't necessarily think about, the safeties, right? I mean, Will Johnson was probably one of his best secondary players he's had in his tenure there. But when I think about Michigan, I think about guys like Aiden Hutchinson, David Ojabo, guys of that nature, Mason Graham. Those big physical guys who he really rejuvenated by just saying, hey, play the style you want to play, and we should be fine. I think when he looks at Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack, he's going to do the same. They're obviously not defensive linemen. They're more linebackers who can blitz if they need be. But he's going to look at them and say, hey, you guys just do what you do best, and we should be fine. But when he looks at the secondary, right, the secondary certainly is a strength for this Los Angeles Chargers defense. When I look at their defense, I would say the linebackers are their best group, then the secondary, and then the front. But overall, I don't think Jim Harbaugh is going to overlook the secondary. I just think that he's going to allow Derwin James a lot of responsibility. And that could be a blessing, that could be a boon, or it could be to his detriment. Because, like I said, Derwin James and injury feel like they've gone hand in hand over the past couple of years. So, considering the fact that Jim Harbaugh seems to have a very hands-off approach to his defensive style, I would say that would make Derwin James a more savvy coverage man. And while it's very rare to see a safety outside of, say, a Jamal Adams type of player to get as many tackles as Derwin James did last year, I think it will be to his benefit to kind of step more into coverage, especially blocking off the back end of the field, because A, it preserves him a little bit, and B, it boosts stats in different areas that you might appreciate more out of a strong safety. Because when you're building an IDP team, you might want to focus more on, D linemen to get you your solo tackles or players of that nature. So that's what I'm looking for from Derwin James this year. He's going to listen to Harbaugh and play it safer and become more of a coverage man who's kind of the last line of defense, or is he going to still maintain his role? I mean, if I were Jim Harbaugh, I would say I need to preserve this guy because his best traits are when it comes to playing that more physical style, but I still need to preserve him. So it's going to be down to Derwin James himself. Does he trust himself as more as a cover man? How does he translate to that style of play? How does he translate to how Jim Harbaugh focuses on other players? And so, looking at Derwin James, this looks like a very hopeful year for him in every aspect of the word. And so, when it's brought into perspective, you look at what the Chargers have and look at what they don't. I think what I'm saying about Derwin James being a coverage man is especially vital, because when your weakest point of your defensive attack is your front three, the pressure on the quarterback is highly minimal. And in a division where you have these receivers that stretch the field. Maybe not as much as other divisions, but still. Say you're playing the Chiefs. And somehow, some way, you as the Los Angeles Chargers are in a position to make the playoffs. The Chiefs are going to want to stretch the field on you. They're going to look at your defensive line and say, Patrick Mahomes is going to have so much time to throw the ball to Marquise Brown, Xavier Worthy, Travis Kelce, Rashee Rice. Do you want Derwin James then blitzing and freeing up more space in behind for that kind of vertical threat, or do you want Derwin James back there at the last line of defense? What I love about this season is it's going to force Derwin James to grow and grow quickly in more aspects of his game. Because I truly think the Chargers are going to be one of those teams who surprises people. And it's going to come down to their defense. And when it's all said and done, the team in the division that you really have to key in on in terms of building that defensive identity is the Kansas City Chiefs, because everyone in that division is looking up at the Kansas City Chiefs. And they're looking up at them because of their verticality at the wide receiver position. So Derwin James, is he going to be a safety linebacker hybrid? Or is he finally going to step up and say, hey, I can drop back in coverage and be that last line of defense that we so vitally need? Because at the end of the day, Jim Harbaugh can only do so much to take the gas pedal off, to release the Kraken, so to speak. These players have to understand that, as Derwin James especially, because we don't want another injured season from him, do we? And that's about going to do it for the segment on Derwin James. Coming up next, we have our final segment of the day, and it's talking about a player who was teammates with someone we talked about previously, and a guy who's really primed for a breakout season along that Chiefs defensive line. We have the player profile of George Karlaftis as our last segment of the day on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast when we come right back. Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We have another player from the Chiefs defense who I wish to highlight in terms of our IDP player profiles to close out today's show. He is on the other side of Chris Jones, and he is someone who I really think is going to have another breakout year in the NFL, and that is George Karlaftis. When I think of the Kansas City Chiefs defense, right, these two in Chris Jones and George Karlaftis are the centripetal forces of what makes this Kansas City Chiefs defense, and especially their defensive front, tick. You have guys like Mike Dana and Derek Nnadi up front, but they're more of like the role player guys. They're more of like the versatility guys who bolster Jones and Karlaftis' few deficiencies, if any. But at the end of the day, when I think about this Chiefs defensive front, I think about Jones and Karlaftis. And Karlaftis, a lot of you might not be savvy to, might not be too knowledgeable of. But I think it's time to get acquainted with this name, because he is going to be a star, especially if Chris Jones ends his contract early, decides to retire earlier than people think. He's really going to take over this Chiefs defensive front and make it his own. So without further ado, let's jump right into what makes George Karlaftis so exciting. Last year, he had an outstanding 166.1 fantasy points, crazy for a defensive end. 29 solo tackles, 7 tackles for loss, 11 sacks, 3 passes defended. And when I think about George Karlaftis, I think about what the Chiefs defense does, because Steve Spagnuolo really likes to vary his defensive schemes. I really believe that George Karlaftis, much like Chris Jones, can play anywhere on the line, and Steve Spagnuolo will be comfortable with it. And what I mean by this is, you can sometimes, if you're the Chiefs, stick a player like Dana or Derek Nnadi either as your main interior defensive tackle and line up Jones and Karlaftis on the outside, and you would have 2 really excellent pass rushers, one who is more powerful, one who's more athletic. You can really put the clamps on an opposing QB. Now, I don't think the Chiefs should necessarily think in that manner, because you really do have a lot of open spaces for players of Jones and Karlaftis' caliber to fill. I think that when it comes to plugging the run, there's not much better than Chris Jones. When it comes to pass rushers, there's not someone who is more promising than a guy of George Karlaftis' caliber. And so, Steve Spagnuolo, for as long as he has both of them together, can, in many different ways, vary these defenses so that they aren't as stagnant as other times he may have had issues with the defense. And so, when I think about George Karlaftis and where he can improve, we talk about this 4-3 front. I think the improvement will stem from what Steve Spagnuolo wants from him and what you might want from him, intriguingly enough, as a fantasy or IDP manager. In a 4-3 defense, George Karlaftis' role, as he might play on the left side of the line, is to mainly rush the passer, but also get in the backfield. And so, when I look at George Karlaftis and look at his pass rushing savvy, that spells 2 things that I can see him being boosted on. One is tackles for loss, and 2 is forced fumbles. Those 2 stats, in my honest opinion, as someone who is getting into IDP, seem like stats that really stand out in terms of how diversely you want to look into your defensive ends. Because edge rushers mainly are looking for sacks from them, but still, you need one of your guys to at least have the ability to turn it on in certain areas that could be the difference between you winning and losing a game. George Karlaftis represents that. He's in a system where he knows that he can eventually become the best player, but he's not necessarily focused on being the best. He's focused on doing what's best for the team. And if he can truly wrap his mind around that, truly get into that mindset, then I don't necessarily think he has to fill Chris Jones' shoes once he leaves. But he's someone who knows what Steve Spagnuolo wants. He's someone who knows that the Chiefs' defense is predicated on their physicality rather than immediate pressure on the QB. And he can trust in the fact that as a star player, he's more of an everyman than a guy who's going to get you 15 to 20 sacks a year. Now here's the caveat that I view. Will he be distracted by Chris Jones' big money contract? And while it seems like an interesting question to ask in terms of fantasy terms, it's an important question to understand in terms of the play and the style of play, especially the Chiefs will employ with both of these guys. Because by tying down Chris Jones, who is on the older side, to 4 years, that's 4 years of George Karlaftis' career in which either A, he improves rapidly and he proves his versatility, or B, more of a premium is put on allowing Chris Jones to be happy and comfortable in many different roles. And so, looking at George Karlaftis as someone who is still up and coming, I think that you have to be cautious of how in future years you draft him. Say this year he does have a breakout year. He boosts his stats in every single category I talked about with him, and he cements himself as someone who can be the running mate with Chris Jones in that front. The next 3 years after that, you then have to consider the fact that, hey, I like this Karlaftis guy, but how is Chris Jones really affecting him? How is, having someone who is still going to be schemed more often affecting him? And so, when you're someone on this team who is young and a lot of people have high hopes for you, but are still with someone who's had so much experience throughout his career on this team, knows this team so well, knows the defensive scheme so well, how does that affect your style of play? And furthermore, when you're in contract talks, how does having a guy who has really dominated your first couple of years of your career, especially the before prime years of your career as you're getting into your prime, how has that affected your style of play? That's the question the Chiefs have to answer in terms of whether or not they really believe that George Karlaftis is the guy. Because at the end of the day, I really like sitting here and saying George Karlaftis adds value to your IDP team. But how much is what's important to me? Because it's all fine and dandy to be the edge rusher who's more athletically inclined, can get into the backfield, his pass rushing moves, maybe open up a couple lanes for your linebackers to get in on the fun. But at the end of the day, George Karlaftis is going to have to learn to preserve the best ideals of this offense in order to make it as potent as possible. And at the end of the day, I really don't think that Chris Jones' contract should affect him, because it should allow him to have more freedom, ironically enough. Now that Chris Jones is tied down, I have to prove that I should be tied down as well when my time comes. And so, George Karlaftis has to absorb the pressure as it comes and not be afraid to grow and expand his pass rush arsenal and expand on what he knows he can improve upon. Because, trust me, I believe that this guy is a really special player that the Chiefs have their hands on. But that should just about do it for this show. Please consider liking, following, subscribing to both the show and the network. Also, If you do feel so inclined, consider leaving a tip or donation to the link in the description. GSMC.cloud is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. But this was yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. We'll be back and better than ever tomorrow for another edition of the show. Thank you guys so much.